In 1922, a young lady named Grace Fryer became concerned when her teeth began to loosen and fall out and her jaw became swollen and inflamed for no apparent reason. She sought help from a local doctor in diagnosing her mysterious symptoms, and using a basic X-ray machine, he discovered serious bone decay, the likes of which he had never seen. Grace's jawbone was honeycombed with small holes in a random pattern like that of moth-eaten fabric. As a series of similar cases began to appear in other women throughout her hometown of Orange, New Jersey, one dentist, Dr. Joseph Neff, took particular notice of the unusually high number of deteriorated jawbones among them. It did not take long to discover a common thread, that all of the women had been employed by the same watch painting factory at one time or another. Grace Fryer and the other women who worked at the Radium Watch Factory painting a glow-in-the-dark compound on the dials of watches, clocks, altimeters, and other instruments had no idea they were actually being poisoned.
"It was a little strange,"
Fryer said.
"When I blew my nose, my handkerchief glowed in the dark, but everyone knew this stuff was harmless."
How did these women with mysterious illnesses become a major turning point in the history of occupational health and safety and the Food and Drug Administration? At the turn of the 20th century, in 1898, famous French scientists Marie and Pierre Curie discovered a new radioactive element they named radium. Radioactivity was somewhat new to science, so its properties and dangers were not well understood, but radium's slight blue-green glow and natural warmth made it a fascinating material. Radium was combined with glue and zinc sulfide, which glowed in the presence of radiation, the result being a glow-in-the-dark paint called Undark. Radium was also marketed for other uses. Radithor, a medical drink sold over the counter until 1931, was heralded as a cure for cancer, and it was said that drinking it bathed the affected areas of the body in liquid sunshine. New products containing Radithor flooded the global market and promised those who took them long life, enhanced energy, and radiant beauty. The radium craze, which began around 1903, familiarized the public with the word radium, and newspaper and magazine articles in the first decades of the 20th century heavily advertised the positive benefits of its use. But was this wonder drug too good to be true? While radium was widely prescribed to patients across the country for a variety of ailments, it was also used by factories to create products used in war efforts. From 1917 to 1926, the U.S. Radium Corporation used Undark to put finishing touches on a line of wristwatches used by America's infantrymen so they could read them at night. Local women in their early teens and 20s were hired to work at the Radium Watch Factory in Orange, New Jersey on an assembly line where they delicately painted Undark on the watch dials to make them glow in the dark. America was in the midst of World War I, and nationally women were fighting for their right to vote. The young dial painters were excited not only by the opportunity to lend a hand in the war effort, but also by the increased pay they would receive over other factory jobs available to them in the area. Grace Fryer started working in the spring of 1917 with 70 other women in a large, dusty room filled with long tables. Racks of dials waiting to be painted sat next to each woman's chair. They carefully applied the glowing bluish-white paint with a camel hair brush to the dial numbers and watch hands. After a few strokes, the brushes would lose their shape and the women couldn't paint accurately.
Our instructors told us to point them with our lips. I think I pointed mine with my lips about 6 times to every dial. It didn't taste funny, it didn't have any taste, and I didn't know it was harmful.
By pointing the brushes with their lips, the women would ingest minute amounts of radium every time they dipped a paintbrush into their mouth. Dial painters averaged 250 dials a day, 6 days a week, and over time, the radium in the paint built up in their systems. By 1922, several of the women from the assembly line began to suffer inexplicable and horrifying symptoms of decay in their teeth and jaws. The women consulted with numerous doctors who diagnosed them with various afflictions such as gingivitis, anemia, sepsis, and phosphorus jaw. In July 1925, Dr. Harrison Martland, Chief Medical Examiner in Orange, New Jersey, suggested that the problems may have been caused by exposure to chemicals at their job site. The women might have become unknown victims of a bizarre new occupational disease if it had not been for an organization called the Consumers League, a women's voluntary society committed to improving working conditions for women and children, and for Walter Lippmann, a crusading journalist and editor of the New York World, a powerful newspaper at that time. The Consumers League, formed in 1899, began to investigate working conditions at U.S. Radium and found a heavily contaminated workplace and skin, bone, and jaw problems in several workers. Interviews with those in authority at U.S. Radium about the careless and unprotected manner in which they handled radium revealed a lack of concern for the dangers of the material being used by the dial painters. Joseph Kelly, the president of U.S. Radium, refused to make suggested changes to improve safety, refused to allow findings from the investigation to be made public, and when asked to pay some of the medical expenses of Grace Fryer and the other ladies having problems, he denied radium had anything to do with their illnesses. Even though Grace Fryer knew she was going against huge odds fighting a major corporation, she decided to file a lawsuit against U.S. Radium. It took her 2 years to find a lawyer willing to take on the case, but on May 18, 1927, Raymond Berry, a Newark attorney, agreed. 4 other women with severe medical problems quickly joined the lawsuit. They were Edna Hussman, Catherine Schaub, and sisters Quinta McDonald and Albina Larice. Each asked for $250,000 in compensation for medical expenses and pain. Sensationalized in the newspapers by Walter Lippmann, they became known as the Radium Girls, and their case, the first of its kind, became a topic of immense public interest throughout the world. The defense attempted to smear the reputations of the Radium Girls by suggesting that they had syphilis, and the companies which worked with radium pressured medical investigators to destroy records suggesting that radium exposure was harmful. The women were ultimately successful, and their fight led to several turning points in history. The case of the Radium Girls, sensationalized by condemnation journalism, consumer protection organizations, and federal government regulators, led to stronger regulatory authority by publicizing harmful products, including radioactive materials, and laid the groundwork for better worker protections from radiation. One of the first turning points came about through the mass media coverage of the lawsuit, which produced a shift away from the belief that radium was a miraculous cure-all drug that could treat everything from acne to cancer. News reports brought greater awareness to the masses and the general public. Launching an outcry for better regulation of products, viewers looked to the federal government. Up until the 20th century, federal laws regulated the contents and sale of foods, and pharmaceuticals focused mainly on additives to foods. In June 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt signed into law the Food and Drug Act, which prohibited any product for consumption to contain additives injurious to health. It was not until the 1930s that the powers of this act began to be consistently enforced through a new organization called the Food and Drug Administration. The Food and Drug Administration, which up until this point had not been a very strong arm of the government at all, really began to take control of the situation. The Radium Girls are often credited with making the FDA the much more powerful organization we know today. Another turning point in history brought about by this case involved occupational health and safety standards. The Radium Girls became the first known victims of industrial radium poisoning. Up until this time, there were no publicly recognized health or safety standards established for handling radioactive materials. After 1928, all dial painters were instructed in proper safety precautions and provided with protective gear. They no longer pointed brushes with their lips and avoided ingesting or breathing the paint. Radium paint was still used on dials as late as the 1960s. Many former dial painters were also participants in long-term studies designed to provide more information about the effects of radium exposure. In 1941, the studies were used by the National Bureau of Standards to establish tolerance levels for radium and sparked the emergence of human radiobiology as a field of study. These investigations had military as well as civilian implications. From 1942 to 1945, data from the dial painter studies were a major source in the health and safety codes developed for the Manhattan Project, which developed the first atomic bomb during World War II. The lawsuit and resulting publicity was also a turning point in the establishment of occupational safety and health. Their case was the first in history to allow individual workers the right to sue for damages from corporations due to labor abuse. The survivors' efforts to seek compensation with help from the Consumers League was yet another turning point in the establishment of legislative protection for workers against industrial diseases. In 1970, President Richard Nixon signed into law the Occupational Safety and Health Act, which assures safe and healthful working conditions by setting and enforcing standards that includes limits on chemical exposure, requirements for the use of personal protective equipment, and requirements for safety procedures. Still today, all organizations have a duty of care to ensure that employees and any other person who may be affected by their workplace remain safe at all times. Without the persistence of the Radium Girls and the media coverage their case provided, it is quite possible thousands more would have died before these changes would have been made.